This is why we still just have an unarmed police. Effectively, you obeyed the rules. You queued. You didn't push people out of the way. You paid for your ticket. You showed it when you were requested to. You didn't make a fuss about it. You didn't play loud music. You didn't eat stinky food. All of these things are eroding. Partly, of course, because we have people from cultures where eating stinky food in public is regarded as being perfectly okay.
Robert Jenrick has got into some hot water recently for this viral video of him stopping people who are breaking the law when they're not tapping into paying for the tube. There was this interview with Susanna Reid on Good Morning Britain where...
exuding the media complacency of people like you.
It seems odd that so many people are defending the criminals and criticising Jenrick for pointing it out. Channel 4 went so far as to make a little film about the fact that Jenrick didn't get permission to film on TfL, as if that was the issue. What do you make of Robert Jenrick's recent escapades?
I think they're rather impressive. I mean, what he's doing very cleverly is, and not James cleverly, but cleverly, is positioning himself in the public eye without actually making all that many big policy statements. This is an interesting political technique. It's essentially symbolic. Some of it is a bit like Trump, which we may talk about later. What you do is you either say something quite simple or a particular act, which is vivid, clearly. This went viral. The action itself went viral. I think it may also be that he's redesigned himself physically. You know, he's been on Ozempic. Here was his rather plump, well-fed, typical Tory frontbencher, backbencher, exuding a certain self-satisfied smugness who had a kind of political conversion. People asked me, do I think it's real, this Damascene conversion? Yes, I do. And it's now been symbolized physically. Weight loss, for heaven's sake, the man has run a marathon and apparently performed in quite respectable time. So he is using himself now in his actions, the fact he's found a really good cameraman, a really good camera crew, who again understand the symbolic role. So here he is, okay, Secretary of State for Justice, Shadow Lord Chancellor, these huge echoing titles. But we all know these grand titles have gone with not exactly a total breakdown, but a very significant breakdown of both big law and order and small law and order. And here he is suddenly almost stepping into the shoes of, well, what the police should be doing, and so conspicuously aren't. He's enacting what a proper state would do, what a proper London transport would do. Because, again, there's a famous argument, isn't there, from New York, and I've forgotten the name of the
broken windows.
The broken windows theory of policing, that if you allow little acts, graffiti, fare dodging, then that whole compact between if you obey the rules, everybody else obeys the rules, and we all get on well, starts to break down. Because, of course, it's the prisoner's dilemma. If you don't obey the rules, if you're allowed to get away with it, you do very well. You don't have to pay. And now, actually, unless you're like me and a senior citizen, over well-funded by the state, travelling on London transport is expensive. And if people do not pay, the cost will continually rise. Now, what I do not understand is the media reaction. I think it is, again, it's this cultivation of supposed victimhood. We've talked about this before, and it's very much built into the whole human rights culture. It's very much built into woke. It's very much built now into the actual law, the preference to the so-called underdog. And really, here is this MP, middle class, rich wife, the whole machinery on his side. They're poor. We should really be feeling pity for them. And I think it is a testimony to a deeply perverted and damaged society. Because we can only get on, especially in large, impersonal cities like London, if basically people obey the rules. And we used to be very good at this. This is why we still just have an unarmed police. Effectively, you obeyed the rules. You queued. You didn't push people out of the way. You paid for your ticket. You showed it when you were requested to. You didn't make a fuss about it. You didn't play loud music. You didn't eat stinky food. All of these things are eroding. That basic, slightly self-effacing politeness which used to make London the envy of the world. This is why Singapore is what Singapore is. When Lee Kuan Yew first came to my college at Cambridge, wasn't even a college then, back in the 50s, he was astonished at this self-regulating quality of British life. Unfortunately, when he transferred it to Singapore, he did it by law. He did it by force. And in order for us to restore it, we may have to resort to that again, which will be profoundly, profoundly sad. So I'm all in favour of what Robert was doing. I think it was impressive. He wasn't aggressive. He simply tried to point out to them what they were doing, and he was greeted, as usual, by a storm of foul language.
The media reaction is fascinating because that video did go viral. More than 15 million people watched it on Twitter. I mean, that's a significant number.
How many other politicians, apart from Farage, have ever achieved anything like that?
And I suspect that it got such a large number of views, not because people were sneering at Robert Jenrick or saying that he was looking down on the poor, but because so many people resonated with his message. So many people, I suspect, are...
You can barely move through a barrier on the tube without some large person pushing you through.
Well, the thing is,
I have twice, quite deliberately, played up my elderly business and hesitated to their manifest fury.
What infuriates me, and I think many people so much, is that we pay for the fares, and you watch people not...
You're a fool. You're a fool.
Right.
You're being made a fool of. This is the problem, what I was saying about rule breaking. It makes you, if you obey the rule, feel like a fool. If you do what we're all supposed to do on the tube, you stand back at the side and somebody else just pushes their way straight in and sits in the only available seat. That's an encouragement to bad manners. And of course, it's an encouragement, actually, to stopping the free movement of people on and off the tube. It is, again, when the rule of reciprocity is broken, when the rules only work if everybody obeys them, and if there is the penalty. Now, as you know, I'm in many ways an iconoclast. I'm a rule breaker in areas where it's important to break rules. These are conventions which simply make everyday life easier and better, and in the case of actually paying for something, actually enable what still... there are problems with it, the deeply impressive structure of the London Underground to continue. Otherwise, it will be a permanent sink of money. It will become as horrible as the subway in New York.
And the problem is that so many people have come into the country, particularly in recent years, who, as you say, don't understand Britain's historic...
Don't understand rules.
Conventions. They don't understand those rules, or at least the rules that we have in Britain, because they come from very different cultures.
And the problem is that the only way we could have ever sorted this out would have been by a deliberate method of inculcating civics. But the problem is that is un-British. We never used to do that. We never needed to do it. I mean, if you look in a country of long-standing immigration like America, there was, going right back to the early 20th century, a very deliberate program of cultural assimilation. You use the machinery of the state. The whole business of Staten Island, the fact immigrants until quite recently had to anglicize their names. You have a very aggressive form of cultural assimilation in state education. You get the whole business of saluting flags and all the rest of it. Our understated culture didn't need that. Was all the more valuable for it. But of course, it makes it vulnerable. It makes it supremely vulnerable. And what's gone wrong in Britain is that we've had this culture in which the rules were unspoken, and you have people who have no sense of rules at all, even when they're written in large red letters and say obey. So, of course, they're enormously advantaged. I mean, I think Robert could have made this point more clearly. If you do not enforce rules, rules, the lawbreaker is enormously advantaged. And so we're in a society now that actively rewards bad behaviour. And it is the stupidity of Channel 4. It's the stupidity of Susan Reid. It's this aggressive stupidity of programmes like Good Morning Britain that fail to understand that. And I find it deeply shocking because, of course, these are profoundly privileged people. How many times do they actually travel the tube? I wonder. These are the people, yes, they go in early in the morning. I know I've done it. A very large car comes outside your front door. Somebody politely opens it to you. They politely open it as you're getting out of the studio. If it's raining, an umbrella is held over your head. These are the people who are insulated. The ordinary public isn't.
Talking about enforcement of these rules, so you mentioned Lee Kuan Yew and his famous description of, I think it was a charity box in Cambridge, where people, put money in.
My college.
Yeah, exactly. And he used the law in Singapore to enforce these rules.
With a very aggressive law.
Right.
You see,
no spitting on the ground, or you go to that kind of thing.
And you're beaten with rods.
Right.
I mean, the flogging there can cripple people.
But the problem, and we've talked about this a lot before with multicultural societies, is that unfortunately, in order to govern those societies, you have to have some
aggressive
kind of authoritarian
aggressive rules.
Exactly.
And
so is that what Britain requires today? Because I'll give you an example. Let's say that I'm on the tube or on a train, as I used to, when I lived in London, did regularly every day, and people start eating smelly food and chatting on the phone and timing loudly and
playing music at full volume,
which is what they do so aggressively, and it's so frustrating. And I, as an Englishman, resent it. I feel very passive aggressive towards the individual, but
being an Englishman, you don't do anything about it.
I didn't do anything about it.
You sit there.
Exactly. And I imagine a lot of people on the tube are probably doing.
So again, Robert's video was a kind of how can I say, a displacement outlet.
Yeah. So should I go up to those people and say, stop doing that? Should we all try and force it ourselves, or is it up to the government to try?
I've tried it. I mean, I did it on a London bus with somebody who was just bawling it, and of course he turned out to be mad. And I wasn't remotely physically intimidated. I'm fortunate, despite my age, not exactly sylph-like. So I wasn't. But it just made it. The problem is these people are totally disinhibited, and if it stops the bus journey, then all people really care about is we get the bus going. As I said, I don't use the tube a lot because I find it inconvenient with all the steps going up and down. But on quite a few occasions, I know exactly what the technique is when somebody starts pressing up behind you. And of course, you can just delay. And unless they actually push you out of the way, which is a little bit difficult.
And what you're talking about, just to be specific, is when they are trying to skip the barrier.
They're trying to skip the barrier. Well, that's right.
When you're going through.
That's exactly right. They're trying to push in behind you. And no. Equally, again, I had interesting you asked this question. I had an exchange a very interesting, gentle exchange on the bus coming here. I got on, and there are various seats which are reserved for the elderly and the pregnant and whatever. I've decided as a matter of rule, if somebody who is not entitled to one of those seats is sitting with them, I very politely ask, fine, I did it. Very nice about it, and got up. And then I noticed behind me there was an older woman. I said, oh, for heaven's sake, you go there. At which point the man sitting next to the woman, who equally wasn't entitled to it, clearly felt a bit guilty. So he got up, and the two of us sat together. And the old lady said to me, oh, that was brave of you. I want to do that, but I don't. I said, I decided when I passed my 80th birthday, I was going to be as I've also been about being gay, that wonderful slogan of gay liberation, better blatant than latent. I was going to be blatant about being elderly. And there's a reason for it. Buses are moved very suddenly. One is less steady on one's feet. But you do it gently. I do it politely. Do you mind? Please. And I've never had a problem.
The problem is all the policing around this stuff seems to be aimed at the wrong demographic. So if you look on the tube today, you'll see lots of posters saying don't stare at people. And a lot of the graphics and the kind of images that they use when they're making these rules are white.
Very, very white.
They're always white men. And it's things like...
Because we know white men like you. Young white men are the origins of all our problems. Like, you go around with a bomb strapped to your middle, don't you?
Well, that's what it feels like in these adverts. And another example, I think there was one about sexual assault on the tube or on the bus. And again, it was all the actors, the evil people are always white men.
By definition.
Right. So it's clear that the authorities do want to police this stuff, but they're not taking it that seriously. I mean, I suspect Sadiq Khan isn't taking it that seriously on TFL. Anyway, we can move on to the UK meme. I thought I mentioned this earlier before the interview started. This is a really interesting online meme where people would basically point out the new multicultural Britain.
And how bloody horrible it is.
Well, they don't even comment on it. They're just literally sharing these videos and pointing out what's happening. So a few examples. You mentioned one video of a woman on the tube eating some kind of rice curry meal with her hand openly. Again, probably wouldn't see that in Britain 50 years ago. There was
50 years ago, 5 years ago.
There was an example of Blue Peter episode where one of the presenters or persons who was being interviewed was speaking with an MLE, that's a multicultural London English accent, talking about something fairly wholesome, but it was quite jarring to see such a traditional British institution for children. I mean, I loved watching Blue Peter when I was growing up, and I know that goes back a long time. Seeing someone with a kind of accent you'd see in like a drill video or, a sort of modern London accent. And there's also videos of, Bradford shopping markets, which are basically, you could be in Pakistan, you could be in Lahore, and it's obviously in the UK.
Finsbury Park, you could be in Mogadishu.
Exactly. So my question is about the UK. Why do you think, or what do you think about the new multicultural Britain and its cultural aspects? Whether it's the music, whether it's the art, whether it's the aesthetic of the whole thing. How do you think it stands up to the old Britain?
What a nice, simple question for this hour of the late afternoon. It has an aesthetic. It's interesting. Some of this has been very, very heavily pushed by the establishment, particularly drill. Stormzy is almost a mascot at Cambridge. He has been allowed, on the back of this stuff, to endow scholarships which are only for black students, which I think is outrageous, but that's another matter. It's also very interesting to listen to the words. The words are of unconscionable violence, of anti-homosexuality, of utter contempt for women, of plugging of drugs. The BBC largely invented this, thanks to Tim Westwood. Now, of course, to be revealed to be a serial abuser of black women, as far as one can tell. But it was pushed by the BBC. Again, the whole notion of the dissolution of boundaries. But you see, that member is both the purpose of high and low art. You are getting into very, very deep waters. But if you go right back to the beginning of modernism, to roughly the end of the First World War, to artists like Marcel Duchamp, the famous chap with the urinal, labeled the Fountain and whatever, in New York, and signed, was it, Rose c'est la vie, Eros, it's life. The purpose of that, this again is where we've completely forgotten. Modern art is about destroying. It's about destroying the old art. Duchamp says quite clearly, Rembrandt's to be used as ironing boards. There was a very recent example of some Spanish painter of much less fame, but still a significant figure in the modern movement. He loved painting over other people's paintings. And as a very interesting symbol, he defaced the portrait of his own mother. You see what I mean? The high art is also about destroying. The the architecture of Le Corbusier envisages threatening everything else. So accompanying this aesthetic of UK, there's the hideousness, the deliberate hideousness of the council estate, but also the National Theatre, the Queen Elizabeth Hall, virtually every new structure. I mean, look at the contrast on either side of the Thames. You have London County Hall, one of the greatest Edwardian Baroque buildings. You've got the vast splendour of Barry's design, puget interiors of the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, which is both a classical building in Gothic dress, and then on the other side, you've got the marvellous Victorian fantasy of St. Thomas's Hospital, with suddenly the entire end of it flattened and a building of repugnant hideousness constructed in the 1960s as this blatant symbol of the new NHS is deliberately, foully ugly. Prince Charles is right. So you see what I mean? There's a kind of folk contribution to this confusion, this obliteration of the past. This again, the whole cultivation of the graffiti. That on the one hand, it's just a lot of nasty boys, and then on with spray cans, and then on the other hand, my God, it's art. So these horrors have penetrated the Royal Academy, and the people who resist, as Prince Charles did, are mocked in exactly the same way that Robert Jenrick was mocked. That you didn't say it's vile, it's ugly, it's edgy. It's the complete new language, isn't there? Rod Liddell is brilliant at this. It's vibrant.
It's King Charles now, we have to remember.
No. I was talking of the days when he was Prince Charles.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the BBC did about 10-minute, 15-minute discussion of the UK meme on one of their radio programmes. And they had three people, including the presenter, who all thought it was terribly racist and a dog whistle and didn't take it seriously at all. One suspects that they don't want to defend the culture that they have created and essentially endorse, and they'd rather just call people racist for pointing it out. But they did make a point that, the UK meme doesn't look at white working class people who they claim also do horrendous things and are aesthetically ugly and unpleasing in some ways. Not all of them, of course, but some. And again, this argument is made by multiculturalists, by the left, that Britain hasn't really changed. We've always had crime. Just look at the Cray twins, look at all the looting and the Blitz, look at some of the murders that happened in the Victorian era. This isn't a new phenomenon. Britain has always been like this, and it's just fuddy-duddies and racists who are saying this is all on immigrants and ethnic minorities. Well,
it's preposterous because, of course, there were areas. There were no-go police areas. Of course there were. In Manchester, I mean, I remember my family comes from the vicinity of Manchester, Oldham, Rochdale. The Moss Side, famously. How was it described? The police could only go in pairs. But if you think of what a typical council estate looked like when I was a boy, it was rigorously policed by the tenants. I remember I grew up on one. And there was one problem family, I can even remember their name, Capstick, who were socially shunned, and they didn't trim their privet hedge, and they didn't really cut their lawns, and they didn't plant their flower beds. Everybody else did. It was maintained by a kind of, I suppose they really, the non-commissioned officers who were the women, the middle-aged women. And I don't know whether you remember Coronation Street, the Ina Sharples figure. They all have bosoms like this, arms akimbo. And any lad who dared to step out of light. Again, it was graffiti are an extraordinarily recent, yes, there'd been historic graffiti. But the plastering of public buildings, of railway lines, it would have been jolly difficult to have done it, of course, because they were soot black in the days of steam. This low-level disorder, again, the police force, although we know in many ways were corrupt, the general level of order in most places was infinitely higher. And it was essentially self-maintained. The single bobby patrolling was a very, very familiar sight. And of course, in the days when I was a young man, you were said good evening. And still in the odd village, you do that. It was always rarer in London. You did it in the neighbourhood. All of that has gone. So I think there is an enormous change. I think there's and again, the types of crime are different. Again, there was, of course, there was poverty. Of course, there was shabbiness. But the general demeanour is completely different. I mean, have you ever looked? Are you interested in football?
Not really.
No. But have you ever looked at photographs of a football crowd well up to the 1960s? All the men will have a collar and tie. They may have a muffler, the scarf, but they will be dressed in a way, the whole manner of our dressing. I mean, look at me. I'm appearing on television without a tie. I mean, I symbolize this terrible decline.
You're the UK.
I'm even the linen jacket. Yes. Neotropical gear. But my father, when he went, my father famously, of course, is a tool maker. Also was a tool maker. You wore a collar and tie. There was a coat overall on top, and the collar was a soft starched collar, which you chain 2 or 3 times a week. It was completely different. Women wore gloves. The thing that does not lie are the photographs of streets, films, and such like, of which there are very large numbers, and you can see. Again, there's a different demeanour. When I was a young man, it was outrageous not to open the door for a woman. Disgraceful for a child to sit in the presence of an adult. That was enforced. There was perpetual fuss about litter. In school, there was rigorous enforcement. You were told that's what you did. And the street scenes one sees, the overflowing litter bin. But again, so many things have conspired. There was a large stretch of time, remember, because of the terrible terrorism of the IRA, when there were very few litter bins. Those habits get broken. Again, one of the things that I think encouraged this discipline was that politicians were no more protected than we were. Gates of Downing. There were no gates of Downing Street. You wandered up there until, again, the IRA under Thatcher, after the Brighton bombing. And that meant, of course, now the elite operate in this world of security, this separation, this enclosed space. It was much, much less.
We're also getting onto the topic of the somewheres and the anywheres. And with the globalization, with recent cheap flights and travel and so on, and being able to move across different countries, the elites, or many of the elites, just don't have the same connections that they used to have to their local communities, perhaps where they grew up, or even to the countries that they live in. So in Britain, politicians may feel that they're a global citizen, for example, rather than living in a nation or in a town or in a community. And those bonds that people have or formed between each other within local communities also seem to be broken, again, partly perhaps because of immigration, where you've got people from all around the world coming into your place with no connection to your culture, to your history, to your society. And, it just seems that all of these bonds have been broken down slowly over the decades to now people don't know each other's neighbours, they don't know the policeman, there's no trust there. And what we're describing essentially is a low-trust society. Let's talk back to Robert Jenrick, because he is basically pointing out some of these issues and has become very well known for doing so. I know we're getting a bit political here, which is slightly tedious, but what do you think of his kind of challenging Kemi Badenoch? Do you think that she is performing well? Do you think that he would be a good replacement for her?
I fear I don't need to comment, do I? We just look at the local government election. We look at the fact that the Conservatives are now regularly dropping below the Liberals in the polls. That tells its own story. The only way the Conservatives can possibly rescue themselves is by a notion of what they're for, which would itself entail a very harsh judgment on their last 14 years in government. What they would have to say is, and here again, popular instincts are rarely completely wrong. In some ways, it's seen as a kind of sloppy thinking. Oh, both main parties are just the same. Actually, there's a very large, what were the main parties? There's a very, very large measure of truth in it. It is perfectly clear now that with David Cameron becoming leader in 2005, particularly with the coalition with Clegg and the Liberals in 2006, there was perfect determination to continue the work of the Blair government. Cameron describes himself as the heir to Blair. Notoriously, Michael Gove, at least he's never corrected the story, passed round copies of Blair's memoirs marked up as the new Machiavelli. This is how to do it. And, of course, many what we think of as the worst aspects of UK, like the hate, non-crime hate incident, date 2014, under the coalition. The introduction of legally binding net zero by 2050, 2015 by Theresa May. The beginning of gender self-identification with Maria Miller, Theresa May. In other words, what the Conservatives would have to do is exactly what Jenrick did. Say, I thought I'd been conservative, but I haven't been. I was wrong. He did it in that particular area of immigration, and he's stuck with it. And what he's doing, he's using all these symbols, these symbolic acts that we are pointing out to say, we've got to break. But it's got to be spelled out. But you've also got to say, not simply, we was wrong. You've got to say why we was wrong. And we was wrong because we did what Blair did, and of course, what the natural instinct of Starmer and Harmer, really crappy firms of off solicitors that belong in the heart of UK, their natural instincts are to do this only worse. But until whoever leads the Conservative Party, they're able to say that, which is, of course, exactly what Thatcher and Keith Joseph did. But then, of course, it was rather simpler, because you were simply saying that the method of economic management, the Keynesian economics, the setting of wages by prices and incomes boards and whatever, was wrong. Nationalisation was wrong. We will do it differently. And by the way, do you know what? Nowadays, it's even worse. We don't set wages by prices and incomes boards. We set them by judges. The derangement of these all from the Conservatives is absolutely. But can we just go back to one thing that I would like to talk about a little bit more? Remember, I am very, very old. And so I can vividly remember the world of the 1940s and the 1950s and the little town that I grew up in the north of England, because I think it's all much more complex than just somewheres and anywheres. What that little town, Kendal, at that point, it was a completely self-governing unit. The people who sat on the council were nearly all local businessmen. I'm not sure if any of them even had a political label. Local businesses were real. They were run locally. They were owned locally. Kendal, although now its MP tells you all you need to know is Tim Farron. So, it represents the sloppiness of sloppy thinking, a kind of thin milk gruel of liberalism. Then it was very different. It was solidly conservative. But what was striking was the number of really big local businesses. K Shoes were the second largest manufacturer of shoes in Britain. Provincial Insurance was a major insurance company. Most of these businesses, Gilbert, Juggs and Gordon's, which I think still exists, major manufacturer of turbines, these were all businesses which were local, but they also were bound with the history of the town in another way. They were nearly all Quaker. They were nearly all Society of Friends, but the owners lived locally and were heavily involved in local charitable activity. This has completely vanished. These towns now have nobody resident in them who is anything more than probably not even a doctor or a dentist. They tend to own the bigger houses outside. And so what you've done increasingly, I think, is to create one-class communities. In fact, are they communities at all? I think this is something that's gone really radically wrong, especially in the north of England. But this is a process of economic amalgamation, of organisations getting bigger and bigger. Again, when I remember, I'm probably a little younger than you are. I'm at Cambridge. I'd already developed an extravagant habits like I have now. I was buying antique furniture, and I bought my first significant piece, which I still have. I was summoned by my bank manager because I'd gone overdrawn to the tune of £23. I received a thorough dressing down. You were on the path to ruin you. Now, that's a good, it made no difference. I can still remember it. But, that again was so completely different. It was in every way face to face.
Without getting into too much of a rabbit hole of talking about Keynesian economics versus monetarism, whatever, some on the left would argue that the kind of Britain that you're describing, particularly with those local businesses and so on, was essentially wiped out by Thatcher's privatisation and her sort of obsession with helping the City of London.
It happened by the 70s.
Yeah.
It happened by the 70s, long before Thatcher.
Okay.
Natural economic change. But again, remember, one of the striking things about America is the importance of local businesses and local banks, which, of course, on the one hand, make the financial system more vulnerable. But the little town that I spent an awful lot of time in on the Eastern Shore, really Joe Biden territory, and just on the other side was Delaware and Rehoboth, and just up the road was Wilmington. But there, much more of that survives, surprisingly. That there is, again, very different traditions of local government, with town meetings, with forms of direct democracy, with a generally elected mayor in a little town. Very different.
Okay, I want to shift gears slightly, and I think you could have a really insightful and interesting answer to this. So today...
Like everything else.
No, particularly on this. Because of your background as an historian. So today, Geert Wilders' government collapsed in Holland. To give a bit of background, Geert Wilders is, obviously a right-wing politician who's very anti-Islam, particularly radical Islam, and mass immigration into Holland. And his coalition government, of which his party was the biggest member, was asking for immigration controls, and essentially the coalition couldn't agree on his demands. And
because he's not actually allowed office.
No, they haven't allowed him to be.
This is the bizarre thing. The man who commands the largest party in terms of the electorate, because of the convention that he's naughty, that he doesn't correspond to this new definition of democracy, which means essentially the protection of minorities, he's not allowed to hold office. As in Germany, the entire fuss in Poland, right throughout Europe.
But just going back to Holland, I think Holland is a really interesting country to talk about, because we've been talking all about Britain. Holland has also experienced very similar issues to Britain, and actually, even before Britain started experiencing the issues that we're having today. I'm just reading a fantastic book by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, her memoirs, Infidel, and she was a refugee. She went to Holland in the early 1990s, and even then she could see, I'm reading the book, I'm like, wow, this is all the same stuff we're seeing today in the UK, but in Holland. And Holland is an interesting country because of its history of Enlightenment values, of basically being somewhere that's allowed freedom of expression.
And monstrous colonialism.
That's true as well. But they're famous for their liberalism. For example, you go to Amsterdam and you can get the marijuana.
But remember, very recently, this is post the German occupation.
Right.
They have a very, very powerful
But what about the religious liberty that they've had that goes back longer than that?
Yes,
but they've allowed refugees in.
But it was the Netherlands was a very uptight society. And remember, again, slightly to dispel myths, they were highly complicit with the German occupations. It is, above all, it's that terrible final siege of Amsterdam, the mass starvation, the whole role of the Gestapo, the whole radical shift away from that heavily Germanified society. Remember, where does the Kaiser take refuge? In the Netherlands, in Dordt. So I think this vision of the naturally liberal. Yes, of course, you can see elements of it. Early tolerance of the Jews and so on. In many ways, the Netherlands acting in the 17th century as almost a prototype to the great changes which were introduced in Britain mainly after 1688-89. But I think again, the cluster of change is post-60s.
That's interesting. So she mentions the cooperation or the collaboration with the Nazis in the war by many Dutch people. And I think more Jews per capita were deported and killed from the Netherlands than any other country.
I think that's correct.
Yeah. And partly because they had such excellent records on who was Jewish and who wasn't Jewish. And this feeling of guilt, she says, amongst Dutch people because of their collaboration in the war led them, and their belief of themselves, whether you say it's a myth or whatever, or how long it goes back, their belief of themselves to be incredibly tolerant and incredibly opening and liberal and free and so on, was basically abused by people from all around the world who came in, including Ayan, and she admits this in the book. She lied about her situation in order to gain refugee status in Holland. And she describes lots of other people doing the same thing, and people coming from it particularly.
So can we just pause and clarify?
Sure.
Because I think it's important that those listening get this sequence of points. What we're saying is that in most ways, despite a certain tradition of high liberalism, the Netherlands was a tightly conformist society which accommodated uncomfortably easily to the worst aspects of Nazis. There is then this profound revulsion at the last stage of the war, in which the Dutch find themselves treated as badly, if not worse, as any other subject population. There is then this sense of national revulsion, which leads to the cult of a high, radical, modern-style liberalism in the full American sense of the term, which, as Ayan says, led people, including her, to take advantage of it. I'm sure that's right. And I
suppose the point I'm trying to make is that a country that can be so liberal and have these values of freedom and so on, it doesn't work when you import people from different cultures with different backgrounds, with different ideas, without a proper integration plan and with the kind of numbers that they've brought in.
But I think equally this kind of we was wrong. That the world that we had, again, here in Britain, it is this whole notion, the 1950s was this period of monstrous, vile oppression. We break the bonds in the 1960s. We then look back with shame at everything we were. The world that you create with that, why is it difficult to contain our own criminals, let alone anybody else's? The moment you have this rule, that there are no rules, that you believe what we decided, and it is completely mad, is basically not that we might have had some wrong rules, but that rules as such are wrong, or indeed you stand it on its head, and no rule is the right rule. And so again, go back to our little example with generic. that it is completely against the rules to enforce the rules. And this leaves you vulnerable to your own criminals, to your own might, which is exactly what we've done. But it's particularly, you can then see it. You can see the odds of disaster ratcheting up. The more you import people who are either have no rules or rules so different that it amounts to much the same. Because again, look at most of the people, or huge numbers of the people that have come here. They're from the poorest countries in the world. They are people, and again, we should use this language. When Kemi said, not all cultures are equal, she is, of course, right, but she was using abstract language. Most of these people are from primitive tribal cultures. There is no notion of individual responsibility. There are elders. There are this mysterious thing called the community leader. The idea that a woman would actually choose which party she voted for.
Or even a husband.
Or especially a husband. Unthinkable. And yet, because, of course, we were a society, Britain itself, a society in which we already very advanced rights, of course, properly, for women and so on. It's a society, and this is the deep paradox. It again goes back exactly to the point with Jenrick. If you have a society, as we were, where essentially obeying rules is something that comes naturally, those who break rules naturally are enormously advantaged. And again, our whole notion of identity was subtle. And we've discussed this before. There isn't such a thing as being British. We were an amalgam of several nations, insofar as there were anyone's national symbol. It was the crown, which is why you rose for God Save the King or God Save the Queen. And of course, into that world in which there is not the kind of obvious blaring symbolism of the American flag, of the Constitution, of all this sort of stuff. Those who don't want, I think they're different values, hate your country, find it extremely easy to accommodate themselves. And even when we tried to invent something, I remember vividly in the early 2000s, Gordon Brown was at the centre, including with the complicity of some very distinguished historians, people like Cannadine and Linda Colley and Norman Davis and whatever, to invent Britishness. But what did it consist of? But apparently, our key values are tolerance and a lack of discrimination. In other words, nothingness. That we are simply an empty box. It's simply being British is a flag of convenience. So when people on the left are very often very, very vigorously asserting, immigrants are proud to say they're British. Because, of course, they can interpret that exactly as they want.
Well, for them, being British is espousing left-wing social values on gay marriage. And they literally say things like that. And you're just like, well, do you know what your ancestors thought? Not only about gay marriage, but all sorts of other things. I mean, just look at Winston Churchill's views on Indians and others, and you'll get an idea of, is he British? Does he espouse what you call British values? Obviously not, but he's as British as you can get. Anyway, let's shift tack completely. I'm glad you mentioned the United States. I live in Washington, D.C. It's a very different political atmosphere, social atmosphere than being in London. You don't see any of the UK aesthetic in some places around D.C. You do in others. But anyway.
You see excessive quantity of it in much of America.
In the ghetto and things. Yeah. But Donald Trump, he's been president for a few months now. So obviously, he's made some controversial decisions on tariffs, on Ukraine. He's made a bit of a splash, but also on the border, he's done amazing things, shutting down the border completely, mass deportations and so on. So let's get David Starkey's view on how the Trump presidency has gone so far in the second time round, and just a bit about the man himself.
It seemed to me aspects of the Trump presidency were extremely carefully prepared for. There was the whole business of the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. There was America First with Stephen Miller, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff. The extraordinary careful drafting of those vast piles of executive orders. You will remember Trump is sworn in very unusually inside in the rotunda of the Capitol. He goes straight back a few blocks along Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, settles down in his old familiar chair in the Oval Office and starts signing this last part. And that aspect of the presidency seemed to me to be very, very impressive. There are other aspects of it that remind you of Trump Mark I. I mean, the whole playing around with tariffs, clearly off the top of his head, and Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, clearly had to take him aside and gently say, do you really want to bankrupt us all, including Trump Towers and all of that, and the bizarre diplomatic interventions. On the other hand, how would I want to characterize most of it? Why is he still riding relatively high? Why are the Democrats, in astonishment of themselves, riding so low in the polls? Let's investigate it. I think it is because we were talking a little bit about this with Robert Jenrick, but Trump is on a completely different scale. He understands the importance of political symbolism in a way, and the symbolism, again, mediated through social media and whatever. But the core of Trump, I think, is much more interesting. Can I remind you of a very remarkable incident, which was when Starmer was there, performing proskinesis as before a Byzantine emperor, or in fact, full kowtowing like a Western trade envoy before a Ming emperor, and proffering up the gift of a letter from King Charles. Did you notice what Trump did with it? He opened it, he didn't read it, he just pointed the signature. Gee, what a signature. And look at Trump's signature. Trump is naturally monarchical. This is why there's this vast outrage in America. He's taking. Remember, there was a vast dispute at the time of the setting up the constitutional debates between 1776 and 1789. A vast debate about how much of a monarchical element there should be in the American Constitution. You have people like Tom Paine who are passionate believers that there shouldn't even be a single president, and which is why Paine, who'd been central hero figure, violently turns against the revolution, violently turns against Washington, and comes up with this wonderful phrase in one of his letters to Washington, that there are many petitions in your bag as there were with James II, about the ultimate insult you can throw. What Trump has done then is to seize this monarchical element and to carry it to its absolute degree. He understands it, and this is why it works, because people here have got absolutely fed up of politicians that don't do anything, can occupy office, utter words, go and stand in front of people wearing hard hats, make tedious speeches. Nothing happens. Whatever they say never happens. Trump has actually mastered the art of at least making things appear and making it seem that he is the person making them happen. That flourish of the pen, the throwing of the pen into the press back, the fact that you govern in front of a TV camera, which is what he does. I mean, high diplomacy is conducted in front of a TV camera. This is like the ultimate royal court.
For example, watching the South African president, shown videos of the abuses against white farmers was an incredible spectacle to watch, and even better TV was with Zelensky in the office. Incredible.
Theatre.
So the left would argue in America that Trump is a dictator, he's not a monarch, and you have this judiciary which is trying to block almost every move that he's making. A lot of Democrat-appointed judges essentially are blocking him from, for example, deporting certain people or trying to sanction Harvard or trying to shut down some US federal offices, USAID, and some other institutions they basically said is fraud or wasteful. So is Trump a dictator? And what do you think of the judiciary trying to block him? Are there lessons that we can learn in Britain from how Trump is governing for the next right-wing government?
I mean, to call him again, we are playing with words. A dictator is a form of monarchy. I mean, if it's in the old sense, in the Roman sense, it was a feature of the Republican Constitution. This is before the empire is declared, in which you had the machinery to appoint a single figure to deal with a major crisis. We, of course, have used it to mean something different, which is the usurpation of all forms of constitutional authority. But I don't think Trump is that at all. What he is doing is he is pushing the monarchical tendencies of the American Constitution to their furthest point. And again, what is very striking, they're all wanting to compare him to Caesar or whatever. He doesn't control an army. This is really vital to understand. An imperial presidency, or Hitler, or Stalin, they controlled the army directly and they deployed it. They deployed force. Trump does not, save in the instance of ICE, save in the business of the deportation of illegals.
Just to clarify what you mean by that, because he is the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, but the army remains totally non-political.
Right.
One of the most remarkable things about America, as in Britain, the country that, in a sense, is the ancestral country, much less than in France, much less than is the general continental tradition. There has never been a military regime in America, despite the fact you have this vast military. Despite the fact that the worship of the veteran, in many ways, it is a remarkable testimony.
Well, you look at France, and even in the 60s, they tried.
Precisely. Well, I mean, de Gaulle. But there you've got, of course, the inheritance of Napoleon. We had the inheritance of Cromwell, Oliver, and decided it was so awful. We never wanted to go down that route again. And we wisely, on the whole, rarely had a very big army. We had a navy, which is a very different, very, very different way of doing it. And indeed, you can argue there are two radically different kinds of expansionist state. There's what's called the vassallocracy, which is a state born by sea and by a fleet, as opposed to the army-based states of continental Europe. And America, because I suppose it didn't have a land enemy, has never developed that tendency. And this, I think, makes Trump... what's going on in America, I think, here again, echoes very closely the position that we would find in Britain if, for example, Howard Trump, if Farage were to be elected. I think there would be exactly the same fight back using legal mechanisms. There would be exactly the same resistance within the civil services there's been within the various federal institutions in America. There will be exactly the same resistance within the universities. And in that sense, it is a lesson that Trump didn't prepare thoroughly enough.
In the first term?
Even in the second. That he did not fully work out. He's also, again, it is the great problem, which you don't have here. An American president doesn't control the legislature in the same way that a prime minister does. Here, if there were to be a properly organized, properly resourced, properly thought through reform regime, for it to do anything the sort that it wanted to do, it would have had to have spent, and indeed would have had to have begun now, the serious program of constructing not simply a legislative framework, not simply acts of parliament, but working out how to head off the civil service, how to cut the legs off the Supreme Court as quickly as you could. Because we've lost any notion, I mean, let's again be quite frank, any notion that most judges are impartial on these kind of questions surely has now gone through the window. It's a terrible thing to say, and I find myself shocked in saying. But because of the whole matters of race, because of the whole matters of the repeated lies that have been told about multicultural societies in Britain, America, wherever else you look, we do live in two-tier societies. Again, something Robert Jenrick has been talking about, and for there to be genuine political action, the genuine addressing of the problems that we are talking about, there will need to be the most extraordinary combination of legislative drafting and political strategy.
Great topic for another interview, but I just want to finish the interview. Whilst we're on the topic of dictators, I mean, Trump obviously isn't a dictator. This is hyperbole. But someone who is President Putin. And in recent weeks, in Russia, there's a statue that was built of Stalin in Moscow Underground Station. And Putin has been talking about Stalin over his long presidency. Not always good, not always bad, but more recently it seems that he's revitalizing or rehabilitating Stalin's legacy, which is fascinating, I think. And there's a clip from about 15 years ago of Putin talking about the statue of Oliver Cromwell outside of the British Parliament, and he compares Stalin to Cromwell. And he says, well, the British remember Oliver Cromwell. He's still a controversial figure, but they still have the statue outside of Parliament. Stalin essentially is someone who we should remember. I just want you to comment on, first of all, this rehabilitation of Stalin, which just is bizarre to us, but in Russia it's a different context. And also this comparison to Oliver Cromwell.
What an interesting question. It's very easy to see why, particularly at this moment. And it is Stalin who even exceeds the Tsars, who carries the frontiers of the greater Russia further to the west than anybody else ever did. But remember, that was the great enterprise of the Tsars. If you will remember, just before he launched the invasion of the Ukraine, he gave that extraordinary long lecture, which everybody laughed at, on the history of the Ukraine. I thought it wasn't actually bad. He talked about the role of Peter the Great in the landward conquest, the role of Catherine the Great and Potemkin in the seizure of the Ukraine from the Ottoman, the seizure of the Crimea from the Ottoman Empire and so on, and wholly admiring. And I suppose it's the natural development and a great many Russians clearly have never forgiven Gorbachev. They've never forgiven that shrinkage. Remember, Russia experienced, in an astonishingly short period of time, the whole of the retreat from empire, which took us from 1945 to
1997,
arguably 1997. They experienced it in a matter of years, couple of years. I mean, all precipitately, and that's a shattering blow. And of course, it was a different sort of empire because it's actually contiguous. It was a manifest rollback. Armies retreated. Again, look at what's going on in the Baltic states, where they are far from treating statues of Stalin with respect. They've all been destroyed, but they're now destroying Russian war memorials. This is a struggle of memory. It's a struggle of memory. Now, what's striking here with Oliver Cromwell, of course, is that statue of Oliver Cromwell, and maybe Mr. Putin would like to think about it, is only put up in the late Victorian period. There's that huge gap. It's the Victorians that revive Cromwell with his passion, particularly Thomas Carlyle, with his passion, with his questing, with his moralizing, with the sheer scale of the man. And again, it's very interesting what Carlyle feels about him, and which I think is true. I mean, I've had this debate with people like Stephen Pounds, isn't it? The Labour MP, appalled when I said I thought Cromwell was unquestionably, the Irish, unquestionably a great man. Remember, Cromwell is, until Napoleon, the only person of modest background that overthrew a monarchy and created a landward empire. He's the only person to have conquered the whole of the British Isles. It's under Cromwell that Britain first, since the late Middle Ages, first becomes a power that the rest of Europe fears. It's an astonishing achievement. He is a great man. He's one of those who makes history. And in that sense, the two of them are not dissimilar. Again, Cromwell is the only person to have ruled the British Isles with a military fist. He was entirely incapable of coming up with a civil administration that actually worked. The comparisons are interesting. Of course, there's nothing like the Terror. Royalists are not terribly kindly treated, especially if they badly behave. But there is nothing like that. There's no real machinery of secret police, though his Secretary of State maintains an extremely good internal system of intelligence. But there remains, again, wildly different from Stalin, there remains an astonishing level of public debate. And indeed, towards the end of Cromwell's period as Lord Protector, there's a quite extraordinary public debate about what sort of constitution should we have. The very fact that Cromwell has done what he did, that you've overthrown one of the ancient monarchies of Europe, you've not simply overthrown it, you've very much more than what the Russians did. The Russians conserve all the jewels and the glories of Tsarism. Here we eradicate the lot. And there is then this, well, what do we put in its place? For a moment it seemed in the 1650s that England was going to start with tabula rasa. But then there was something very different. Again, the response to the fall of the Protectorate, first the death of Oliver and then the dethroning of his son, Richard. Stalinism in the Soviet Union was, of course, the culmination of the structures of communism. It was dismantled slowly, or a little, under Khrushchev and whatever, and then radically after 1789. What happened? But you didn't go back at any point to Tsarism. Those structures of aristocracy and whatever. On the other hand, what England did in 1660 was to bring back, to restore the whole of the previous world. This is something very remarkable about England. Despite the revolution, despite Oliver, despite the rule of the major generals, England restores itself. All of those advanced speculations about shall we have a system based on ballot like the Venetian Republic, very seriously discussed, go by the board, and you go back to the good old way of how we'd always done it. And fundamentally, that was the right thing to do. The Russians couldn't do that because the revolution was already, how old was it? The revolution was already 60, 70 years old. The old world had been eradicated. In other words, the genuine tragedy of Russia in the post-Gorbachev age is the old world was so completely dead. You had nothing but the ruins of the horror of communism. And it's a country which I think is a genuine tragedy.
Just very briefly on Oliver Cromwell, a fascinating answer. So do you think that his legacy essentially was not long-lasting on British politics? Was the Civil War not a kind of prediction of, or kind of predating the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament is reasserting itself?
No, because the first thing Oliver Cromwell does after he's cut the king's head off is to shut Parliament down. Improve your history. He finds Parliament just as unmanageable as Charles had done. It's a genuine experiment. It's an experiment in a different way. It is military dictatorship. Oliver Cromwell, like Napoleon, I would argue more than Napoleon, is a straightforward military dictator. And the regime is completely incapable of establishing legitimacy, whereas Napoleon does in France. There is a Napoleonic revival. His nephew actually makes himself, very French, isn't it? First Prince President, first Prince President, and then Napoleon III. So there's a Napoleonic tradition. There's no Cromwell tradition. But there is a tradition. What there is a tradition is a tradition of radical improvement in the honesty and the efficiency of government servants. Somebody, for example, the most famous figures of this period, Pepys, the diarist, is a product of the Cromwellian age. His patron, Sandwich, been a major figure. And that improvement in the standards of administration is, I think, very much a legacy of Cromwell. The idea of a reordering of government. I mean, again, these speculations continue right through. They are vigorously revived, for example, by John Locke at the time of the Glorious Revolution. But again, what we forget, in 1689, the English do not invent a Lockean polity. We don't have a we do have a convention, but it's only called a convention because Parliament can only be summoned by a king. But that Parliament doesn't decide, we are going to readjust things ourselves. All it does, it has a bargain with the incoming king. It bargain with William, Prince of Orange. We're going back to the Netherlands at this point, and you do something else. You pretend that the line of succession hadn't been broken. You don't say we're going to just elect a king from scratch. We say, well, actually, because James I fled, you know what? He actually abdicated, didn't he? And by the way, although it had a child, it was supposititious. So really, if you do a little bit of elaborate playing with the genealogical tree, we could kind of say that William and his wife Mary, who is James's daughter, of course, are really the actual heirs to the throne. So you fudge it. Don't. And again, this is what is very striking. Why did Cromwell find it so hard to transform himself from the great military leader that he was into an acceptable form of government? Because being a Lord Protector was unknown. Nobody had any idea what it meant. Why there is such urge to have the monarchy back? You knew what the powers of a king were. And this is the remarkable and the peculiar thing about England. In the next century, when again all these debates about the Constitution become even more prominent than they've been before, again, the run-up to that, I always call it the Third English Civil War, which is the American Revolution. One of the leading figures of the age, Lord Chesterfield, a great letter writer and man about town, comes up with this wonderful phrase: England is the only monarchy that has a constitution. And Cromwell couldn't be a constitutional ruler. Charles II could be. James refused to be. William III had to be.
On that note, David Starkey, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure you being here, so thank you again.
Pleasure.